A millionaire bet he wouldn't touch her all night while she wore nothing, but what happened next will shock you. Hello, my very beautiful family. Welcome home to your own channel, Mr. Peter Stories. This is where love lives, and stories touch the soul. But today my heart is heavy. So many fake channels are stealing my content, my voice, my hard work, my sweat, and my passion. And I'm not seeing the fruits of what I pour out from the depths of my soul. It hurts, because I give you my best, always, but I believe in something stronger than hate. I believe in us, and I believe in God. So before we begin, please pause with me, and let me speak a prayer over your life. My Lord, I lift up my beautiful family and each heart listening right now. I pray you wrap them in your arms and never let go. Protect them from every pain, every silent battle they don't speak of. Heal what's broken, restore what's been lost, and overflow their homes with peace. Let their dreams rise like the morning sun, and may every tear be turned into joy. Bless their children, their work, their homes, and their hearts. And above all, never let them walk alone. In Jesus' name, amen. My family, if you love what we do, please don't let the fake ones win. Subscribe, like every video, comment "I stand with Mr. Peter," and share it in your WhatsApp group or on any platform you can. Let's start this story with love, and only love. The Metropolitan Museum of Art glittered like a crown jewel that evening, its grand halls filled with New York's elite for the annual Spring Charity Gala. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over the crowd dressed in their finest, their laughter tinkling like the champagne in their flutes. Sandra Christina stood apart from the clusters of wealthy patrons, a vision in crimson silk that hugged her curves before flowing to the floor in a dramatic sweep. The bold color made her a flame in a sea of safe, predictable black attire, drawing appreciative glances that she pretended not to notice. At 32, she had perfected the art of polite dismissal. Tonight wasn't about her. It was about securing donors for her struggling community gallery in Harlem, where neighborhood children discovered worlds beyond their circumstances through art. So far, the evening had yielded plenty of empty compliments, but no checkbooks. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," a deep voice observed from behind her, the words wrapped in a German accent that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. Sandra turned, her prepared smile freezing as she met the most piercing blue eyes she'd ever seen. The man standing before her was tall, imposingly so, with shoulders that filled out his custom tuxedo with an athlete's grace. His face could have been carved from marble, strong jaw, high cheekbones, and lips that seemed to hover between a smirk and a smile. "Thorsten Labs," he introduced himself, extending a hand. Sandra knew the name immediately. The German-born investor had amassed a fortune through tech investments before turning 30 and was now one of the most significant private art collectors in the country. "Sandra Christina," she replied, placing her hand in his. Instead of the customary handshake, he turned her hand gently and brought it to his lips. The brush of his mouth against her skin sent a current racing up her arm, catching her completely off guard. "The curator from Harlem," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your exhibition on emerging black female artists last fall was provocative." Sandra withdrew her hand, surprised he knew of her work. "Provocative wasn't what I was aiming for. Truthful was more the goal." A smile touched his lips. "Truth is always the most provocative thing in rooms like this." He gestured around them. "Most people here prefer comfortable lies wrapped in gilt frames." Despite herself, Sandra felt a smile tugging at her lips. "And what do you prefer, Mr. Labs?" "Thorsten," he corrected, his accent caressing the syllables of his own name in a way that made it sound like velvet. "And I prefer things that can't be easily categorized or contained." His eyes traveled over her face with an intensity that felt almost tangible. "Things that challenge me." Something in his tone made Sandra's skin warm. She was accustomed to wealthy men who viewed women, especially women who looked like her, as conquests. She'd learned long ago to armor herself against such attention. "Well, I'm afraid I'm not here to challenge anyone," she said coolly. "I'm here to secure funding for arts education in communities that are consistently overlooked by patrons in rooms exactly like this one." Instead of being put off by her directness, Torsten's eyes lit with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Tell me about your gallery." For the next 20 minutes, she found herself engaged in the most stimulating conversation she'd had all evening. Torsten asked insightful questions about her curatorial philosophy, her community outreach, and the artists she championed. He listened with an intensity that made her feel as though her words were being engraved rather than merely heard. "You speak of art as though it's oxygen," he observed when she paused for breath. "For some of the kids in our programs it is," she replied. "It's the first place they can breathe freely." A shadow passed over Torsten's face, something haunted and knowing, before it disappeared behind a carefully neutral expression. "And what was art for you, Sandra Christina?" The use of her full name in his accented voice sounded almost like a caress. She hesitated, unused to being asked such personal questions at these events. "Salvation," she finally said, surprising herself. With her honesty. "My mother cleaned houses for the wealthy. Sometimes they'd let me look at their art collections while she worked. I fell in love with how a painting could transport you somewhere else. Be someone else, even if just for a moment." Torsten nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "And now you create those portals for others." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Sandra couldn't name. It was Torsten who finally broke the spell, gesturing to a waiter for fresh champagne. "Your gallery, it's struggling." "Financially." His tone was matter-of-fact, not pitying. Sandra stiffened. "We're solvent but underfunded, like most places that serve communities without deep pockets." "I could help," he said, the words offered casually, as though he were suggesting assistance with a minor inconvenience rather than potentially saving her life's work. "I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Labs." "Torsten," he corrected again, a hint of impatience coloring his tone. "And I don't offer charity. I make investments." "My gallery isn't for sale," Sandra replied, her voice firm despite the champagne warming her blood. A small circle had formed around them, other guests noticing the prolonged conversation between the notorious reclusive millionaire and the striking curator in red. Among them was a man Sandra recognized as Julian Mercer, Torsten's business partner, and according to art world gossip, the only person who could claim to be his friend. "Torsten doesn't believe in anything that can't be bought," Julian interjected with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance, "including self-control." "That's not true," Torsten said, his eyes still fixed on Sandra. "Some things are beyond price." Julian laughed, clearly several drinks into the evening. "Says the man who once spent 14 million on a painting he doesn't even display." "It wasn't about displaying it," Torsten replied. "It was about the challenge of acquiring it." Something in that statement bothered Sandra. "So, it's locked away somewhere because the thrill was in the chase, not the art itself?" Torsten's eyes narrowed slightly. "You disapprove." "I think art should be experienced, not hoarded," Sandra replied, emboldened by the champagne and the intensity of his gaze. "And I think people who collect trophies rather than creating connections are missing the entire point of existence." A hush fell over their small circle. No one spoke to Torsten Labs that way, especially not at events where he was the biggest potential donor in the room. To everyone's surprise, Torsten smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face from handsome to breathtaking. "You're right," he said simply. Julian, clearly trying to diffuse the tension, laughed again. "Careful, Sandra. You've found Torsten's weakness. Beautiful women who aren't afraid of him." "Julian," Torsten warned, his voice low, but Julian was already warming to his subject. You know what Torsten's famous for besides his collection, his self-control, ice water in his veins, once went 3 days without sleep to close a deal in Tokyo? Sandra raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Congratulations on your capitalist machismo, she said dryly to Torsten, whose lips twitched with what might have been amusement. It's not about machismo, Julian continued. It's about discipline. The man could sit in a room with a naked supermodel and not touch her if he decided it wasn't in his interest. Julian, enough, Torsten said, his voice dangerously soft, but something had sparked in Sandra's mind, something reckless and challenging. Perhaps it was the champagne, or the frustration of another gala where the wealthy talked about helping, while keeping their checkbooks firmly closed, or simply the electric current that had been humming between her and this arrogant, fascinating man since they'd met. Is that so? She asked, fixing Torsten with a bold gaze. You think you have that? Much control? Torsten's eyes darkened as they met hers. I know I do. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. Sandra's heart hammered against her ribs as an audacious idea formed in her mind. Prove it, she said, her voice low enough that only he and Julian could hear. A wager? What kind of wager? What kind of? Torsten asked, his full attention on her now. One night, sunset to sunrise. Sandra's pulse raced as she continued. Me, naked in your presence. You're not allowed to touch me. At all. Julian's eyes widened in shock, but Torsten's expression remained unreadable. And the stakes? Torsten asked, his voice dropping to match hers. If you can resist touching me until sunrise, I'll curate your private collection, properly catalogue it, arrange it, make it into something meaningful. It was the most valuable thing she could offer, her expertise, her vision. But if you fail, you donate $5 million to my gallery's community programs. Julian let out a low whistle. You can't be serious. But Sandra's eyes never left Torsten's. Completely serious. For a long moment, Torsten studied her face, searching for something. Then, to Julian's evident shock, he extended his hand. Deal. As Sandra placed her hand in his for the second time that evening, she felt as though she were stepping off a cliff. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and a current of awareness passed between them that made her breath catch. What neither of them acknowledged, what neither could possibly know, was that they had both just placed bets on the wrong things. The true wager wasn't about touch or money or professional services, it was about what would happen to their hearts. Chapter 2. Preparations. 3 days had passed since the gala, and Sandra still couldn't believe what she'd done. Standing in her modest Harlem apartment, she stared at the dress hanging on her closet door. Not the crimson gown from the charity event, but a simple black wrap dress she would wear to Torsten's penthouse tonight. Wear and then remove. You've lost your mind, she told her reflection as she applied mascara with trembling fingers. Her phone chimed with a text from her best friend Zora. Are you really going through with this crazy bet? Sandra sighed. She'd told Zora everything the morning after the gala, expecting her friend to talk her out of it. Instead, after the initial shock, Zora had been surprisingly supportive. Yes. $5 million for the gallery, Zora. For the kids. The reply came instantly. And this has nothing to do with how you haven't stopped talking about how his eyes look like the ocean during a storm. Heat rushed to Sandra's cheeks. She glanced at the lingerie laid out on her bed, black lace she'd purchased yesterday in a moment of madness. Would she even wear it? The terms of the bet specified nakedness, not seduction. After a moment's hesitation, she pushed the lingerie aside. No, she would not use such obvious tactics. This wasn't about seducing Torsten Labs, it was about proving a point, that his legendary control wasn't as impenetrable as he believed. And yet, as she slipped on her dress, Sandra couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with nervous anticipation and everything to do with the memory of Torsten's intense gaze. across town. Torsten stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching the sunset paint Manhattan in gold. In 30 minutes, Sandra Christina would arrive, and this absurd wager would begin. "You could still cancel," Julian's voice came from behind him. "Say you've got a sudden business emergency in Tokyo." "I don't back out of agreements," Torsten replied without turning. "This isn't a merger agreement, Torsten. This is you alone with a gorgeous woman who'll be naked, trying not to touch her until sunrise." Julian shook his head. "I was drunk when I suggested it. What's your excuse?" Torsten finally turned, his face impassive. "You think I'll lose control?" "I think you're human, despite the rumors to the contrary." Julian studied his friend. "What's this really about? You could donate 5 million to her gallery with the same thought you give to ordering lunch." Torsten returned his gaze to the skyline. "She thinks I'm just another soulless collector. Another rich man who takes without giving back. And you care what she thinks because..." The question hung in the air, unanswered. Torsten himself wasn't sure why Sandra's opinion mattered so intensely. He only knew that when she'd looked at him with those amber eyes full of challenge, something long dormant had awakened inside him. He moved to his kitchen, checking the wine cooling in an ice bucket, a Chablis he'd selected personally, not trusting his usual staff with tonight's preparations. The dinner menu had been carefully considered: oysters, figs, chocolate, foods traditionally considered aphrodisiacs. A deliberate challenge to himself, though he'd never admit it. "You've arranged everything?" Torsten asked, changing the subject. Julian nodded. "As requested. Chef prepared dinner and left it warming. Staff has been dismissed until morning. Security has been informed about your private meeting and to admit no one until morning." He paused. "The guest room is prepared, though I still don't understand why. I won't have her sleeping on a sofa if she gets tired," Torsten said simply. Julian shook his head again. "You're overthinking this. The bet doesn't say you have to entertain her all night, just that you can't touch her. I'm aware of the terms. Are you?" Julian raised an eyebrow. "Because I'm starting to think this is about more than proving your famous self-control or avoiding a donation." Torsten turned to face his friend fully. "What else would it be about?" "Connection," Julian said simply. "When was the last time you spent an entire night actually talking to a woman? Not working, not networking, not negotiating, just being present with another human being?" Torsten's jaw tightened. "Good night, Julian." Understanding the dismissal, Julian headed for the elevator. At the last moment, he turned back. "Remember something, Torsten. Some bets, even when you win them, you lose." Alone, Torsten ran his hand through his hair, disturbed by Julian's perception. He couldn't deny that something about Sandra Christina had gotten under his skin. The way she'd challenged him, seen through his carefully constructed facade to something beneath, something he himself rarely acknowledged. He moved through his apartment, adjusting details with uncharacteristic nervous energy. A painting straightened, fresh flowers arranged more artfully, logs added to the fireplace to combat the spring evening's slight chill. Torsten paused before the large mirror in his hallway, studying his reflection critically. He'd chosen dark jeans and a simple white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, deliberately casual, though the shirt alone cost more than many people's entire wardrobes. He wanted Sandra to see him differently tonight, not as the cold, calculating millionaire from the gala, but as the man beneath. The elevator's discreet ping announced her arrival, sending an unexpected jolt through his body. Torsten took a deep breath, centering himself. This was just a wager, a challenge, nothing more. But as the doors opened and Sandra stepped into his penthouse, the crimson dress replaced by a simpler black one that somehow made her even more beautiful, Torsten knew he was lying to himself. This was already something more, and the night hadn't even begun. Chapter 3. The beginning. Welcome, Torsten said, his accented voice washing over Sandra like warm honey. She stepped into the vast penthouse, momentarily stunned by the panoramic views of Manhattan stretched out below them. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a living painting, the sunset casting everything in a golden glow that seemed almost staged in its perfection. "Your home is beautiful," Sandra said, struggling to maintain her composure despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "Thank you." Torsten stood a careful distance away, as though already mindful of their arrangement. "Would you like a tour? Before dinner?" Dinner? Sandra hadn't expected that consideration. A smile touched Torsten's lips. "Did you think I'd immediately demand you disrobe? What kind of host would that make me?" The playful note in his voice surprised her, hinting at a warmth she hadn't glimpsed at the gala. "A very direct one," she replied, relieved by the momentary lightening of the tension between them. "I can be direct when necessary," he said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But I see no reason to rush. The sun has barely set. We have the entire night ahead of us." Something in the way he said those last words sent a shiver through Sandra's body. Not fear, but anticipation. The night stretched before them, filled with possibility and danger in equal measure. Torsten led her through the penthouse, pointing out architectural details and art pieces with genuine enthusiasm. Sandra was surprised by his collection, not the ostentatious display of wealth she had expected, but thoughtfully curated pieces that spoke of personal connection rather than acquisition for status. "This is stunning," she said, pausing before a large canvas depicting a mother and child, rendered in vibrant colors that seemed to pulse with life. "Alma Thomas," Torsten said, coming to stand beside her. "One of the first pieces I acquired that truly moved me rather than impressed me." Sandra turned to him, reassessing. "You know her work?" A pioneering black female abstract expressionist, overlooked for decades because of both her race and gender. His eyes met hers. "Not unlike many of the artists you champion in your gallery. You've done your research," Sandra said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "I always research what interests me," Torsten replied, his gaze lingering on her face in a way that made it clear he wasn't only talking about art. The moment was interrupted by a discreet chime. "Dinner is ready," Torsten explained. "Shall we?" He led her to a terrace where a small table had been set with fine china and crystal, a single candle flickering in the center. The city spread out below them, lights beginning to twinkle as darkness fell. "This is—" Sandra struggled to find words. "Too much?" Torsten asked, suddenly uncertain. "No," she said honestly. "Perfect." Something shifted in his expression. Relief, perhaps, or pleasure at her approval. He pulled out her chair, careful not to touch her as she sat, then took his place across from her. The dinner was exquisite. Fresh oysters, followed by perfectly seared scallops, accompanied by a crisp white wine that complemented each course. Their conversation flowed more easily than Sandra had anticipated, touching on art, literature, travel, and even childhood memories. "So, your mother was a housekeeper too?" Sandra asked, surprised by this connection between them. Torsten nodded, his expression softening with memory. "In Bremen, she cleaned for wealthy families while raising me alone." He took a sip of wine. "She would sometimes bring me with her during school holidays. I'd sit quietly in corners, watching how the rich lived, learning to be invisible." "Just like me," Sandra said softly. "Except I wasn't invisible. I was exploring their art collections while my mother worked." "Different approaches to the same circumstance," Torsten observed. "You sought beauty, I studied power." The insight struck Sandra deeply. It explained so much about him, his drive, his carefully constructed persona, his collection of beautiful things that he kept private, as though beauty itself was a secret vulnerability. As dinner concluded, a new tension descended between them. The sunset had faded completely, leaving them in the gentle glow of candlelight and the distant sparkle of the city. "I suppose," Sandra began, then faltered. "It's time to honor our wager," Torsten finished. For her, his voice low, she nodded, suddenly breathless. "There's no rush," he said gently. "We have all night, but if you wish to proceed, the bathroom is through there." He gestured toward a hallway. "Take all the time you need." Sandra rose from the table, grateful for his consideration. The bathroom was a marvel of marble and glass, larger than her entire bedroom at home. She caught her reflection in the mirror, flushed cheeks, bright eyes, the picture of nervous anticipation. "This is just a bet," she whispered to herself, reaching for the tie of her wrap dress, just a body, nothing he hasn't seen before. And yet, as the dress fell open, revealing her naked skin beneath, she had decided against the lingerie after all. Sandra knew this was far from just anything. She folded her clothes neatly, then stared at her reflection for a long moment, gathering her courage. $5 million, she reminded herself, for the kids. With that thought firmly in mind, she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and opened the bathroom door. The living room was dimmer now, lit only by the fireplace and a single lamp. Torsten stood by the windows, his back to her, a silhouette, against the city lights. At the sound of her entrance he turned. The look on his face stole Sandra's breath. It wasn't lust or shock or amusement, emotions she had prepared herself for. It was something closer to reverence, a stunned appreciation that made her feel more like a masterpiece than an object. "Sandra," he said, her name barely a whisper. She forced herself to walk forward, stopping in the center of the room. "Well, here I am. The terms of the bet are officially in effect." Torsten's gaze traveled slowly over her, but not in a way that felt invasive. Rather, he seemed to be memorizing her, appreciating her as he would a work of art, with respect for both, the creation and the creator. "You are," he began, then seemed unable to find the right word. "Extraordinary." Despite her nervousness, Sandra felt a surge of power. This man, who reportedly controlled financial empires with iron discipline, was struggling to form sentences. "You seem surprised," she said. "Did you think I would back out?" Torsten shook his head slightly. "No, I never doubted your courage. I just hadn't fully prepared myself for—" He gestured vaguely toward her. "For seeing me naked," Sandra supplied. Finding her confidence growing, with each moment he remained clearly affected by her presence. "For seeing you," he corrected, his eyes returning to hers. "Truly seeing you." The distinction struck her as profound in a way she hadn't expected. Her silence stretched between them, charged with something beyond physical attraction. "May I offer you something to wear?" Torsten finally asked. "Not because I need you to cover yourself," he added quickly, "but because I want you to be comfortable." Sandra considered the request. "The bet specifies I must be naked. I don't want any technicalities if you lose." "When I lose," Torsten said with surprising candor, "it won't be because of a technicality." The admission sent a shiver through Sandra. "You think you'll lose?" "I think," he said carefully, "that there are different kinds of touching, Sandra, and I'm already touching you in ways that have nothing to do with skin." The truth of this observation settled over her. Standing naked before him physically was just one layer of the vulnerability they were sharing. "I brought a robe," she conceded. "For moments when I might need it." Torsten nodded. "I'll get it for you." He moved toward the bathroom, careful to keep a wide berth around her. In his absence, Sandra took a moment to glance around the room, noticing details she'd missed earlier. There were books everywhere, not displayed for show, but clearly read, some with markers still in them. A sketchbook sat open on a side table, a charcoal pencil beside it. She moved closer, curious, and caught her breath at the drawing, a cityscape at dawn, rendered with surprising skill. Below it was another sketch, this one of hands, old and weathered, working at what appeared to be a loom. "My grandmother," Torsten said from behind her, causing Sandra to startle slightly. He stood a careful distance away, holding out her silk robe. She was a weaver, created the most beautiful tapestries from nothing but thread and patience. Sandra accepted the robe, slipping it on but leaving it untied. "You drew these?" A flicker of something like embarrassment crossed Torsten's face. "A hobby, nothing more." "They're beautiful," Sandra said honestly. "You never mentioned you were." "An artist." "I'm not," he said quickly. "Not like the artists you work with." "Art isn't about credentials, Torsten. It's about expression, communication." She gestured to the grandmother sketch. "This says more about your relationship with her than an hour of conversation would." Torsten studied her face, seeming to search for insincerity and finding none. "Perhaps we should sit," he suggested, moving toward the large sectional sofa that faced both the fireplace and the city views. Sandra followed, settling at one end while he took the other, maintaining the required distance between them. As the robe draped open, leaving her essentially exposed, she realized the initial awkwardness had faded. In its place was something more interesting, a growing curiosity about the man across from her. "Tell me about your grandmother," she requested, softly, pulling her legs up beneath her. As Torsten began to speak, his voice low and melodious in the firelit room, Sandra knew the night had taken a turn neither of them had anticipated. This wouldn't be a simple test of physical restraint, it would be a revelation of souls. Chapter 4. Revelations. The grandfather clock in Torsten's study chimed midnight, its resonant tones echoing through the penthouse. Sandra poured herself a glass of water from the crystal pitcher on the side table, acutely aware of Torsten's gaze following her movements. Her robe had slipped from one shoulder, but she no longer felt any urgency to adjust it. 4 hours into their night together, her nakedness had transformed from a tactical challenge into something more nuanced, a vulnerability that paradoxically made her feel powerful. "I want to try something," Torsten said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "A game of sorts." "What kind of game?" Sandra asked, intrigued by the spark of playfulness in his eyes, something she wouldn't have believed possible from the stern businessman she'd met at the gala. "Truth for truth," he explained, leaning forward. "I ask you something I truly want to know, and you must answer honestly. Then you do the same for me." "With no limits?" Sandra raised an eyebrow. "That sounds dangerous." "The most worthwhile things usually are," Torsten replied, his accent thickening slightly, as it tended to do when he spoke from the heart rather than the mind. "But if you prefer boundaries—" "No," Sandra interrupted, her curiosity piqued. "No boundaries. Truth for truth." Torsten nodded, considering his first question carefully. "What's the real reason you became a curator instead of an artist yourself? I've seen how you look at art. There's creation in your gaze." The unexpected perceptiveness of his question caught Sandra off guard. Most people asked about her career path, in terms of education or opportunity, not the soul deep choices that had shaped her life. "I tried," she admitted, setting down her glass. "For years, I painted, sculpted, sketched, searching for my voice, but nothing I created felt necessary." She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "Art should add something to the world that wasn't there before. My own work never did that. But I discovered I could see what made others' work sing, could help them refine and amplify their voices. I found my art in curation, in creating conversations between artists and audiences that might never have happened otherwise." Torsten nodded slowly, absorbing her answer with the same intensity he'd shown all night. "That's beautiful," he said simply. "My turn," Sandra said, choosing her question with care. What's the real reason you collect art? Not the public reason, not the explanation you give at galas, the truth. Torsten's eyes reflected the dancing flames from the fireplace as he considered her question. Control, he finally said. When I was a child, I owned nothing. Everything could be, and often was, taken away. His voice dropped lower, more intimate. The first painting I ever purchased was a small watercolor at a street market in Paris. Nothing valuable, but it was mine. No one could take it from me. Sandra nodded slowly, understanding blooming in her chest. And now? Now I own pieces worth millions, and I still sometimes wake up feeling like that boy with nothing. A self-deprecating smile touched his lips. Pathetic, isn't it? No, Sandra said softly. Human. Their eyes met across the space between them, a space that seemed to be shrinking by the minute, despite neither having moved. My turn, Torsten said, breaking the charged silence. Why did you really make this bet? The truth, Sandra. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling in a way that drew his gaze momentarily before he deliberately returned it to her face. I'm tired of being seen as just a body, she said, the words coming more easily than she'd expected. Men like you, powerful, wealthy, you look at women like me and see something to possess, to conquer. I thought, she hesitated, then committed, to the full truth. I thought proving you couldn't control yourself would be satisfying, would prove something about men like you. But I also wanted to prove I'm more than just something to be desired, that my mind, my vision for art and community was worth your attention. Men like me, Torsten repeated, no judgment in his tone. Just a question, yes, no. Sandra sighed. I thought you were like that. At the gala, when we first met. Now I'm not so sure. And what would winning this bet mean to you now? Torsten asked, though it wasn't his turn. Sandra allowed the question anyway. Now I'm not sure what winning looks like anymore, she confessed. The honesty between them was becoming its own form of intimacy, deeper perhaps than physical touch would have been. Sandra shifted position, the silk of her robe sliding further off her shoulder. Torsten's eyes followed the movement, then deliberately returned to her face with a discipline that spoke volumes. Your self-control is impressive, Sandra observed. You could have touched me already, several times. I would never have been able to prove it. That would defeat the purpose, Torsten said simply, which is to prove something to myself, not to you. He leaned forward slightly. May I show you something? At Sandra's nod, Torsten rose and disappeared down a hallway, returning moments later with a leather portfolio. He sat closer to her than before, though still maintaining enough distance to honor their agreement. These have never been shown to anyone, he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice as he handed her the portfolio. Sandra opened it carefully, gasping softly at what she found inside. Page after page of drawings, sophisticated and emotionally evocative. Portraits mostly, each capturing not just a likeness, but an essence. An old man feeding pigeons, his face lined with stories. A young woman dancing alone in a crowded club, her expression one of private joy. A child building a sandcastle at the edge of the ocean, determination etched in his small features. Torsten, she breathed. These are extraordinary. He looked almost embarrassed by her praise. They're just moments. People I've seen who seem to have something worth remembering. Sandra turned another page and stopped, her breath catching. The drawing showed a gallery, her gallery. And there she was, guiding a group of children through an exhibition, rendered with such care that she could almost feel the passion radiating. From her drawn self. You came to my gallery, she asked, looking up at him in surprise. 3 months ago. You were giving a tour to children from the neighborhood. You didn't see me. I stayed in the back. Why didn't you introduce yourself? Torsten's expression softened. Because you were so perfectly in your element, so alive with purpose. I didn't want to intrude with all that comes with... He gestured vaguely at himself. With being Torsten Labs, she finished for him, understanding dawning. So you just watched, and drew me. Yes. His eyes held hers, unguarded for perhaps the first time. You were the most beautiful thing I'd seen in years. Not because of this. He gestured to her body, still mostly exposed beneath the open robe. But because of the light that comes from inside you when you talk about art, when you connect those children to something larger than themselves. Sandra felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. No one had ever seen her that way, seen past her appearance to the passion that drove her. "Is that why you agreed to the bet?" she asked softly. "Because you'd already seen me?" Torsten nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "When you challenged me at the gala, all I could think was that I finally had a reason to spend time with the woman who'd been haunting my thoughts for months." The confession hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing. They were still bound by the terms of their wager, still separated by the space they'd agreed to maintain. Yet something fundamental had shifted, the motivation behind. Their unusual night together revealed as something far more meaningful than either had initially admitted. Sandra closed the portfolio carefully, returning it to Torsten's hands. Their fingers didn't touch, but they came close, so close she could feel the warmth of his skin. "Why art?" she asked, steering them toward safer ground while she processed this revelation. "With your mathematical mind, your business acumen, why? Are you drawn to something as subjective and emotional as art?" Torsten considered her question, his expression thoughtful. "Because art tells the truth when nothing else can," he said finally. "In business, in finance, everything is abstraction, numbers representing value that only exists because we agree it does. But art," his eyes lit with genuine passion, "art bears witness to what it means to be human. It endures when empires fall and currencies fail. That's why you keep your collection private," Sandra realized suddenly. "It's not about possession or status for you. It's personal." "Yes," Torsten admitted, "though perhaps that's selfish in its own way." "Maybe," Sandra agreed, "but it's a different kind of selfishness than I accused you of." Outside, rain had begun to fall, droplets streaming down the floor-to-ceiling windows in silvery rivulets. The city lights blurred through the water, creating an impressionist painting of urban nightlife. Sandra rose, suddenly needing movement to process the revelations of the past hour. She walked toward the windows, her reflection ghost-like against the night sky. After a moment, Torsten joined her, standing close enough that she could sense his presence, but not so close as to violate their agreement. "What happens when the sun rises?" she asked, watching their reflections rather than turning to face him directly. "When this night is over?" "I suppose that depends on who wins the bet," Torsten said, his reflection's eyes meeting hers in the glass. "And if you win?" Sandra pressed, needing to know. "Then I gain the privilege of having your expertise transform my collection," he said, his tone making it clear how much he would value that. "And if you lose, then your gallery receives the funding it deserves." He was quiet for a moment. "But either way, Sandra, I think we both know this night has already changed something between us that can't be unchanged." The truth of his words settled over her. Whatever happened with their wager, they could never go back to being strangers or even casual acquaintances. They had shared too much, seen too deeply into each other's souls. "It's strange," Sandra said finally, turning to face him. "I've never been more physically exposed to someone. Yet I feel like you're seeing parts of me that no one else has ever really looked at." "Perhaps that's the irony of our bet," Torsten observed. "By eliminating the possibility of physical touch, we've created space for a different kind of intimacy." Sandra nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The rain intensified, outside, drumming against the windows like a heartbeat. Inside, in the warm glow of the fire, two people who had begun the night as virtual strangers found themselves navigating toward a truth neither had anticipated. With each revelation, each shared memory, each honest answer, the true stakes of their wager were becoming clear. It wasn't about money or pride or professional services. It was about the terrifying possibility of being truly seen, and the even more terrifying possibility of being accepted anyway. Chapter 5. The Art of Seeing. "You like to see the rest of my collection?" Torsten asked, his voice gentle against the rhythmic backdrop of rain. The storm had intensified outside, turning Manhattan into a watercolor of blurred lights and shadows. Sandra nodded, pulling her silk robe closer around her shoulders, though she left it untied, honoring their agreement while seeking a small comfort against the chill that had crept into the air. "I'd like that," she said, genuinely curious to see what treasures this enigmatic man had gathered. Torsten led her through the penthouse, careful to maintain the distance between them. Each room revealed new facets of his taste, contemporary. Installations in one space, Renaissance sketches in another, abstract expressionism alongside African tribal masks. But what struck Sandra most was the thoughtful placement of each piece. The conversation created between disparate works, the obvious care taken in their display. "You didn't curate this randomly," she observed, stopping before a striking juxtaposition of a Basquiat and a 16th-century Dutch still life. "No," Torsten admitted, "though I've never had a professional curator's eye." "You didn't need one," Sandra said honestly. "You have an intuitive sense for dialogue between pieces." A pleased smile touched his lips, warming his usually reserved features. "That might be the highest compliment you could give me." They continued their tour, Torsten explaining the stories behind certain acquisitions, Sandra asking insightful questions that revealed her expertise without pretension. As they moved through a darkened hallway toward what Torsten described as his private study, he paused to adjust the lighting, his hand brushing against the wall switch. In that moment, Sandra's bare foot accidentally touched his, a whisper of contact so brief it might have been imagined, yet electric enough that both froze instantly. Their eyes met in the dim light, awareness crackling between them like the lightning now flashing beyond the windows. "I'm sorry," Sandra whispered, though the apology seemed inadequate for the current still running through her body from that fleeting touch. "It was an accident," Torsten said, his voice rougher than before. "The bet stands." He stepped back, creating space between them again, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. The physical attraction they'd been carefully dancing around all night had announced itself, impossible to ignore any longer. Torsten cleared his throat, visibly composing himself. "This way," he said, leading her into a room that made Sandra gasp aloud. Unlike the rest of the penthouse, with its clean lines and modern aesthetic, this space was intimate, almost sacred. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, interspersed with smaller artworks that seemed more personal than prestigious. A fireplace cast warm light over comfortable leather chairs, and a large desk near the window was covered with papers, books, and drawing materials, evidence of actual use rather than staged perfection. "This is where I spend most of my time," Torsten said, watching her reaction closely. "It feels like you," Sandra replied, understanding instinctively what she meant. While the rest of his home was impressive, this room revealed the soul of the man. She moved toward a small sculpture on a pedestal near the fireplace, a bronze figure of a dancer, her body curved in an expression of both strength and surrender. "This is exquisite," Sandra said, leaning closer to examine the patina. "An unknown artist from a small village outside Prague," Torsten explained, coming to stand beside her. "I found it in a tiny gallery that was about to close permanently. The sculptor had died the year before, never having achieved recognition. So you saved his legacy, Sandra said softly. I tried. There was a note of genuine regret in his voice. I bought everything the gallery had of his work, but most of his pieces had already been scattered or lost. Sandra turned to look at him, seeing past the wealthy collector to the man who cared deeply about art and artists. That's why you need a proper catalogue of your collection, she realized. Not for prestige, but for preservation. Torsten's eyes met hers, filled with a gratitude that needed no words. In that moment, Sandra felt a connection that transcended their physical separation, a meeting of minds, of values, of purpose. There's something else I'd like to show you, he said, moving toward a door at the far end of the study. It opened into a smaller room, clearly designed as a personal gallery space. Unlike the public areas of the penthouse, where priceless works were displayed with museum-like precision, this room held pieces that seemed chosen purely for emotional impact rather than monetary value or prestige. In the center stood a marble sculpture of the female form, abstract yet powerfully evocative. Sandra moved around it slowly, mesmerized by how the stone seemed to capture both strength and vulnerability, power and grace. This reminds me of you, Torsten said quietly from behind her. Sandra turned, startled by the personal nature of the comment. Me, beautiful, yes, he said, his eyes moving over her with an intensity that made her skin warm despite the distance between them. But not just beautiful, powerful, self-contained, complete in yourself. The words touched something deep inside her, a recognition she hadn't known she was seeking. Standing there in nothing but an open silk robe, Sandra had never felt more seen, not for her body, which was obvious, but for her essence, which was not. No one has ever described me that way before, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Then you've been surrounded by the blind, Torsten replied simply. The rain continued to fall outside, creating a cocoon of intimate sound around them. In this private gallery, surrounded by art, chosen purely for love rather than investment, Sandra felt the barriers she'd built around her heart begin to crack. She moved toward a small painting in the corner, a child's hand reaching toward a butterfly, rendered with such tenderness that it brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Who painted this? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. A 9-year-old girl in a Berlin children's hospital, Torsten answered, coming to stand beside the painting. Part of an art therapy program I fund. Sandra turned to him in surprise. You fund art therapy? A shadow passed over Torsten's face. My mother died of cancer when I was 8. There was no money for treatment beyond the basics, certainly none, for anything that might have eased her spirit during the pain. His voice dropped lower. I promised myself that if I ever had the means, I would ensure others had what she didn't. The vulnerability in this admission struck Sandra deeply. This was no calculated revelation designed to impress, but a painful truth offered as a gift of trust. The artist, the child, Sandra asked softly. What happened to her? A smile transformed Torsten's face, making him suddenly breathtakingly handsome. She recovered. She's 17 now, planning to study art therapy herself. Joy bloomed in Sandra's chest at this unexpected happy ending. You keep in touch with her? With all of them, Torsten said simply. There are 36 children whose treatments I've funded over the years. Some didn't survive, but many did. He gestured around the small gallery. Each piece here was created by one of them. Sandra looked around with new eyes, seeing now what she'd missed before. This wasn't just a private collection of emotionally resonant art. It was a testament to lives touched, to pain transformed through creativity, to hope preserved in the darkest circumstances. This is why you agreed to our bet, she realized suddenly. Not just because you were intrigued by me, but because you understood what my gallery is trying to do for the children in Harlem. Torsten nodded slowly. You're passion for bringing art to those children. It echoed something in me, something I recognized. The distance between them seemed both vast and non-existent in that moment, physically separated by their agreement, yet emotionally closer than Sandra had felt to anyone in years. "I misjudged you," she admitted. "At the gala, I thought you were just another wealthy collector acquiring art like trophies." "And now?" Torsten asked, his eyes never leaving hers. "Now I see you," Sandra said simply. Something powerful passed between them, a recognition, an understanding that went beyond the physical attraction that had been simmering all night. In this room, filled with the artwork of children who had faced mortality far too young, surrounded by evidence of compassion neither of them had initially credited the other with possessing. They found common ground neither had expected to discover. Sandra moved toward the door, needing space to process, the emotions swirling through her. "I think I need a moment," she said honestly. Torsten nodded, respecting her need for distance. "The guest room is yours whenever you wish to rest. No obligation to continue our conversation if you need time." The consideration in his voice, the genuine respect for her boundaries even in this unusual circumstance, touched Sandra deeply. She retreated to the guest room, where the silk sheets against her bare skin felt like a whispered invitation she wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. Lying in the dark, listening to the rain against the windows, Sandra tried to reconcile the Torsten Labs she had met at the gala with the man who funded children's art therapy programs, who drew portraits of strangers that captured their essence, who had noticed her months before their official meeting and been moved enough to sketch her from memory. She hadn't anticipated this complexity, this depth beneath his controlled exterior. She had expected to prove him shallow, to expose his lack of control. Instead, she was discovering layers to him that made her own carefully constructed barriers feel suddenly fragile. The bet had been a reckless challenge, meant to prove a point. Now, as the night deepened around her, Sandra wondered if they had both miscalculated what was truly at stake. Chapter 6. Dawn's Temptation. Sandra woke disoriented, the unfamiliar softness of the bed momentarily confusing her. Moonlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the guest room in a silver glow. The digital clock on the nightstand read 4:38 a.m. Dawn would arrive in less than 2 hours. She hadn't meant to fall asleep, had only intended to rest her eyes for a moment. Now, fully awake, she was struck by the strangeness of her situation, lying naked beneath silk sheets in Torsten Lab's penthouse, part of a wager that had evolved into something neither of them could have anticipated. Sleep had cleared her mind, bringing clarity to what had been building between them throughout the night. This was no longer about winning or losing a bet. It was about two people who had unexpectedly found something rare in each other: understanding, connection, possibility. Rising from the bed, she wrapped her silk robe around herself and padded barefoot into the hallway. The penthouse was quiet, bathed in the same ethereal moonlight that had woken her. She found Torsten in the living room, seated before the dying embers of the fire, a book open in his hands, though his eyes were fixed on the glowing coals. "You didn't sleep," Sandra said, softly, announcing her presence. He looked up, his face softening at the sight of her in a way that made her heart skip. "I wasn't tired." She moved into the room, stopping a few feet from him, mindful still of their agreement. "What are you reading?" Torsten closed the book, showing her the cover. Pablo Neruda's love poems in the original Spanish. "You speak Spanish?" she asked, surprised. "Enough to appreciate Neruda," he replied with a small smile, "though I'm sure I missed nuances a native speaker would catch." Sandra settled on the couch across from him, tucking her legs beneath her. The robe fell open slightly, revealing the curve of her thigh, but she no longer felt self-conscious under his gaze. "Read me something?" Torsten's eyes darkened at the request, But he opened the book again, finding a page he had marked. In a voice low and melodious, he began to read, the Spanish words flowing like music from his lips. Though Sandra didn't understand every word, the rhythm and emotion in his voice conveyed the poem's essence, a declaration of love that was both earthly and transcendent, the intimacy of the moment wrapped around them like a physical touch. Torsten's accented voice, caressing the passionate Spanish syllables, created an almost unbearable tension in the space between them. Sandra felt her skin warming, her breath coming quicker, her body responding to the sensuality of the moment despite the physical distance they maintained. When he finished, silence fell between them, thick with unspoken feelings. "What does it mean?" Sandra finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Torsten looked directly into her eyes. "It speaks of a love that transforms, that sees beyond the physical to the soul beneath. The poet says, 'I love you without knowing how or when or from where. I love you straightforwardly without complexities or pride. So I love you because I know no other way.'" The words hung in the air, neither of them acknowledging how perfectly they seemed to describe what had been growing between them through the night. "It's beautiful," Sandra said softly, her throat tight. With emotion. "Yes," Torsten agreed, his eyes never leaving hers. "Beautiful things often emerge from the most unexpected circumstances." Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city glistening and quiet in these hours before dawn. Sandra moved to the windows, gazing out at the sleeping metropolis below. Torsten joined her, standing close enough that she could feel his warmth, though he maintained the careful distance their wager required. "I've been thinking about our bet," Sandra said, watching their reflections in the glass, "about what winning really means." "And what have you concluded?" Torsten asked, his voice low. She turned to face him. "I think perhaps we were both seeking the wrong victory." Torsten nodded. Slowly. "When this night began, I believed winning meant proving my self-control. Now I wonder if true strength lies in allowing oneself to be vulnerable." "Yes," Sandra breathed, the single word conveying her complete understanding. They stood in silence, the space between their bodies charged with possibility. Dawn was approaching, the eastern sky beginning to lighten almost imperceptibly. Their time together under the terms of the wager was coming to an end. "If I asked you to touch me now," Sandra said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, "would you?" Torsten's eyes darkened, his expression a complex mixture of desire and restraint. "Is that what you want, Sandra?" Her heart raced as she considered the question. Was it what she wanted? The answer surprised her with its clarity and certainty. "I want—" She hesitated, searching for words that could express the truth of what had happened between them. "I want what touches me to be more than hands. I want to be seen by someone who understands that the most important parts of me aren't visible at all." Something shifted in Torsten's gaze. A recognition, a surrender of sorts. "I've been seeing you all night," he said softly. "From the moment you walked into that gala months ago, challenging everything I thought I knew, I've been unable to look away." Sandra felt tears spring to her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. One escaped, trailing down her cheek in a silvery path. Without hesitation, Torsten reached out and brushed it away with his thumb, his touch feather-light against her skin. The simple contact, the first physical connection they had shared all night, sent an electric current through Sandra's body. It wasn't just desire, though, that was present too. It was recognition, completion, the physical manifestation of the emotional intimacy they had been building for hours. "You lose," Sandra whispered, but there was no triumph in her voice, only wonder. "No," Torsten said, his hand still cradling her face, as though it were the most precious thing he had ever touched. "I think, finally, I win." The sky outside was definitely lighting now, the first golden rays of dawn beginning to touch the highest buildings. In mere minutes, the sun would rise, officially ending their wager, but neither was watching the horizon any longer. Time seemed suspended as they stood there, connected by the simple touch of his hand against her cheek, a touch that conveyed more than words or bodies ever could. "What happens now?" Sandra asked, feeling both stronger and more vulnerable than she had ever been. "Now," Torsten said, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip, sending shivers through her entire body. "We begin again, not as a bet or a challenge, but as two people who have finally found what they didn't know they were looking for." As the first ray of sunlight broke through the window, casting them in golden light, Sandra closed the remaining distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey, familiar yet new, comforting yet thrilling. Torsten's arms encircled her, drawing her against him as the rising sun painted them in shades of gold and promise. The silk robe slipped from her shoulders, falling forgotten to the floor, as his hands finally, reverently explored the body that had been forbidden to him all night. "I've imagined this moment for hours," he murmured against her neck, his accent thicker with emotion, "yet the reality of touching you exceeds everything I dreamed." Sandra's hands found their way beneath his shirt, eager to feel his skin against hers after the long night of restraint. "Take me to your bed," she whispered against his lips. "The sun is rising. The bet is over." Torsten lifted her into his arms, as though she weighed nothing, carrying her through the penthouse to his bedroom, a space she hadn't seen during their tour. Unlike the minimalist design of the rest of his home, this room was surprisingly warm, with rich woods and deep blues creating a sanctuary that felt both masculine and inviting. He laid her gently on the bed, then stood back, his eyes traveling over her with undisguised appreciation. "You are so beautiful it hurts to look at you," he said softly. Sandra reached for him. "Then stop looking and start touching." With a groan that seemed torn from somewhere deep inside him, Torsten joined her on the bed. Their bodies came together with an urgency born of hours of restraint, yet tempered by the emotional connection they had forged throughout the night. His hands and lips learned her body with exquisite attention, discovering what made her sigh, what made her gasp, what made her cry out his name. In turn, she explored him with equal fervor, delighting in the strength of his shoulders, the firmness of his chest, the vulnerability in his eyes when she touched him in ways that broke through his careful control. When they finally joined, it was with a sense of inevitability, as though their bodies were merely following a path their souls had already taken. Torsten moved above her with a devotion that brought tears to her eyes, his gaze never leaving hers, maintaining the connection that had begun with a challenging bet and transformed into something neither had expected to find. As the sun rose, fully over Manhattan, bathing the room in golden light, Sandra and Torsten found release together, their bodies expressing what words could not yet fully articulate. In the aftermath, they lay entwined, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "I lost $5 million, Torsten murmured, amusement coloring his voice. Sandra propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, her hair falling in a curtain around them. "Are you complaining?" He laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest beneath her hand. "It's the best investment I've ever made." She smiled, then grew serious. "The gallery really does need the money." "And it will have it," Torsten said, brushing her hair back from her face with tender fingers. "I'll transfer the funds today." "A bet is a bet. And what about us?" Sandra asked, suddenly uncertain. Was this just about the wager? Torsten's eyes held hers, all trace of amusement gone. "This was never about the bet, Sandra. Not really. The bet was just an excuse. A way for two people afraid of vulnerability to spend time together without admitting what they really wanted. And what did we really want?" she whispered. This, he said simply, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Connection, understanding, the chance to be seen, truly seen, by someone who values what they're seeing. Sandra laid her head back on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. Outside, Manhattan was awakening to a new day, unaware that in a penthouse high above its busy streets, two people who had begun the night as opponents had found in each other something neither had dared to hope for, a chance to be truly known, truly accepted, truly valued. The bet was over. Their story was just beginning. Chapter 7. New Territory. The morning sun streamed through Torsten's bedroom windows, turning Sandra's skin to burnished gold as she slept peacefully beside him. He propped himself up on one elbow, watching the gentle rise and fall of her breath, marveling at how drastically his life had changed in the span of a single night. For years, he had built walls around himself, careful, impenetrable fortresses designed to protect the vulnerable boy who had learned early that attachment meant inevitable loss. And yet in less than 12 hours, this extraordinary woman had somehow slipped past every defense, making herself at home in places within him he'd thought permanently sealed. It terrified him. Sandra stirred, her eyes fluttering open to find him watching her. A slow smile spread across her face, still soft, with sleep. "Good morning," she murmured. "Good morning," he replied, unable to resist tracing the curve of her shoulder with gentle fingers. "What time is it?" "Nearly 10, Torsten said. "I've never slept so late." Sandra stretched languidly, the sheet sliding down to reveal more of her beautiful body. "I'm not surprised. We didn't get much sleep. The memory of their love-making, urgent at first, then slower, more exploratory as the night progressed, sent warmth flooding through him. But with the daylight came clarity, and with clarity, doubt. What happened now? Where did they go from here? The bet was over, its terms fulfilled. She had won her funding, he had lost his self-control. By any reasonable measure, their transaction was complete, except nothing about this felt transactional anymore. Before he could voice these thoughts, his phone began to vibrate insistently on the nightstand. A cascade of missed calls and urgent messages lit up the screen, all from Julian. "I should take this," Torsten said reluctantly. "Julian wouldn't keep calling unless it was important." Sandra nodded, slipping out of bed and gathering her robe from where it had been discarded on the floor. "I'll give you privacy," she said, disappearing into the bathroom. As soon as the door closed behind her, Torsten answered the phone. "What is it? Finally!" Julian's voice came through, equal parts relieved and irritated. "I've been trying to reach you for hours. The Tokyo deal is collapsing. Nakamura is threatening to walk unless you personally address his concerns about the labor retention provisions." Torsten closed his eyes, the real world crashing back with unwelcome force. The Tokyo acquisition represented 18 months of work, 3,500 jobs at stake, and a cornerstone of his company's Asian expansion strategy. "When do they need me?" "They're waiting for your call now. I've stalled as long as I can, but—" "Give me 30 minutes, Torsten interrupted. "I'll handle it." He ended the call, a cold weight settling in his stomach. When Sandra emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in her silk robe, her hair damp from the shower, Torsten was already dressed in a crisp suit, his expression once again the controlled mask she'd first encountered at the gala. "You're leaving," she said, a statement rather than a question. "I have to," he replied, hating the formality that had crept back into his voice. "A business situation requires my immediate attention." Sandra's face remained carefully neutral, but he saw the flicker of hurt in her eyes. "I understand." "No, you don't," Torsten said, moving toward her but stopping short of touching her, suddenly unsure of his right to do so, now that the intimate bubble of the night had burst. "This isn't me running away, Sandra. This is just my life. 3,000 workers in Tokyo are counting on this deal going through, their families, their futures. Of course, she said, her voice cool. We both have lives to return to. The bet is over after all. The distance in her tone cut him more deeply than he would have thought possible. This isn't about the bet, he said, frustration edging into his voice. This is about responsibility. I said I understand, Torsten. But she didn't. Not really. How could she? In the space of a night, they had shared incredible intimacy, yet they were still virtual strangers in so many ways. I've arranged for the money to be transferred to your gallery's account, he said, immediately regretting how transactional it sounded. 5 million, as agreed. Sandra stiffened visibly. Thank you, she said, the words formal and distant. An awkward silence fell between them, so different from the comfortable quiet they had shared throughout the night. Torsten wanted to bridge it, to explain the storm of emotions and responsibilities pulling him in different directions, but the words wouldn't come. My driver can take you home whenever you're ready, he said finally, checking his watch. Tokyo was waiting. Or you're welcome to stay if you prefer. I should go, Sandra replied, gathering her few belongings. I have grant applications due by 5. She disappeared into the bathroom again to change, emerging minutes later in the simple, black wrap dress she'd worn the night before. Somehow, she looked more vulnerable, fully clothed than she had naked. Smaller, more fragile, yet holding herself with a dignity that made Torsten's chest ache. Sandra, he began. Not sure what he wanted to say, but knowing he couldn't let her leave like this. It's okay, she interrupted, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Last night was extraordinary, but we both knew it was just one night. Is that what you want it to be? Torsten asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. Before she could answer, his phone buzzed again. Julian, Tokyo, responsibility calling. Sandra saw the conflict on his face and made the decision for him. Go, she said softly. Do what you need to do. She moved toward the elevator, but Torsten caught her hand, unable to let her leave without some promise, some assurance that what they'd shared wasn't ending. Have dinner with me, he said quickly. Tonight, let me explain properly, without distractions. Something vulnerable flickered across her face before she masked it. Torsten, you don't owe me anything. The bet is settled. This isn't about the bet, he insisted, still holding her hand. This is about us, please. After a moment that seemed to stretch forever, she nodded. All right. Dinner. Relief flooded through him. I'll pick you up at 8. No, Sandra said, firmly. My place. I want neutral territory. Torsten understood immediately. She needed balance, needed to assert some control over whatever was happening between them. Your place at 8, he agreed. She nodded once, then slipped her hand from his and stepped into the waiting elevator. As the doors closed between them, Torsten felt a sense of loss so acute it was almost physical. His phone buzzed again, demanding attention. With a last glance at the closed elevator doors, he turned away, forcing his mind to shift from the woman who had upended his carefully ordered existence to the business empire that required his immediate focus. The Tokyo call extended into a video conference with lawyers from 3 continents, then an emergency board meeting to approve the revised terms. By 6 o'clock, Torsten's eyes burned from staring at screens, and his head pounded from the tension of high-stakes negotiation. But the deal was salvaged, the workers' positions secured with even stronger protections than the original agreement had provided. As his car navigated the evening traffic toward Harlem, Torsten loosened his tie and attempted to shift mental gears. The Tokyo deal had demanded every ounce of his legendary focus, but now his thoughts returned to Sandra with an intensity that surprised him. Less than 12 hours apart, and he missed her with a physical ache he'd never experienced before. His Driver pulled up outside a modest brownstone in a rapidly gentrifying block of Harlem. The neighborhood bore visible signs of the tension between longtime residents and the wave of wealthier newcomers. Community gardens beside trendy coffee shops, colorful murals across from upscale boutiques. Torsten approached Sandra's building, a bouquet of wildflowers in hand, chosen specifically because they weren't the roses or orchids he typically sent to business associates. These were vibrant, unconventional, resilient, like her. When Sandra opened her door, the sight of her in a simple blue dress that made her eyes luminous momentarily robbed Torsten of speech. The surroundings, her small but warmly decorated apartment, suited her perfectly, filled with art, books, and touches of vibrant color. "Come in," she said, her smile cautious but genuine. "I hope you like pasta. It's one of the few things I cook well." "I love pasta," Torsten replied, suddenly aware of how hungry he was after a day of ignored meals. He handed her the flowers. "These reminded me of you." Sandra's expression softened as she arranged the wildflowers in a mismatched ceramic vase. "Thank you. They're beautiful." They navigated through dinner with careful conversation, Torsten explaining the Tokyo situation in terms of the workers rather than the profits, Sandra sharing stories about her gallery's young artists. The tension between them gradually eased, though something tentative remained, as if neither was certain of the ground rules for this new territory they were exploring. After dinner, Sandra poured them each a glass of wine, and they settled on her small couch. The proximity was both thrilling and unnerving, so different from the penthouse where their physical distance had been mandated by their wager. "I'm sorry about this morning," Torsten said finally, setting down his wineglass. "I handled it badly." "You had a crisis to manage," Sandra replied with a small shrug. "I understand that." "It's more than that," Torsten admitted. When I woke up with you, I felt something I haven't experienced in decades. Happiness. Simple, uncomplicated happiness." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "It terrified me." Sandra's expression softened. "Why would happiness terrify you?" "Because happiness can be taken away," Torsten said quietly. "Because caring about something, someone, means creating a vulnerability that can be exploited." "Is that how you see connection, as a vulnerability to be exploited?" "It's been my experience," he admitted, "in business certainly, and the few times I've allowed someone close personally." He shook his head. "Let's just say it reinforced the lesson." Sandra studied him, her gaze penetrating yet compassionate. "That's a lonely way to live, Torsten." "Yes," he agreed simply. "It is." "So where does that leave us?" Sandra asked, the directness he'd first been drawn to at the gala returning. "Are you saying you can't do this, whatever this is becoming, because it makes you vulnerable?" "No," Torsten said quickly, reaching for her hand. "I'm saying it scares me, but not enough to walk away." The admission hung between them, perhaps the most honest thing he'd ever said to a woman. Sandra intertwined her fingers with his, the simple contact sending warmth up his arm. "It scares me too," she confessed. "You live in a world of private jets and billion-dollar deals. I live paycheck to paycheck, fighting for grant money and community support. When I left your penthouse this morning, the doorman barely hid his surprise that you'd had someone like me upstairs." Torsten frowned. "I'll speak to him immediately." "That's not the point," Sandra said gently. "The point is, we come from different worlds that don't easily mix. Then we create our own," Torsten replied, the solution presenting itself with startling clarity. "A world that takes the best of both," Sandra smiled, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. "Is that possible?" "I don't know," Torsten admitted, "but I know I want to try." As the evening deepened, the distance between them on the couch gradually disappeared. Torsten found himself sharing stories he rarely told, about his grandmother's cottage in Germany, about the art teacher who had encouraged his drawing until his stepfather had put an end to such useless pursuits, about the first time he'd walked into a major museum and felt like he'd found home. In turn, Sandra told him about her college years working 3 jobs to pay tuition, about the mentor who had given her first gallery job against the board's wishes, about the neighborhood children who had inspired her to start her community programs. When midnight arrived, neither was ready for the evening to end. "Stay," Sandra whispered, echoing his request from the morning. Unlike the passionate urgency of their first night together, this time they came together slowly, learning each other's bodies with deliberate care, in the familiar surroundings of her own bedroom. With faded posters from art exhibitions and books stacked on every surface, Sandra revealed new dimensions of herself. A playfulness, a confidence, a way of looking at him that made Torsten feel not just desired but cherished. Afterward, as they lay tangled in her sheets, the sounds of the city filtering through her partially open window, Torsten traced patterns on her shoulder with gentle fingers. "I have to fly to Singapore the day after tomorrow," he said quietly. 3 days of meetings I can't reschedule." Sandra tensed slightly in his arms, and he hurried to continue. "I want you to come with me." She propped herself up on one elbow, surprise evident in her expression. "To Singapore. I can't just drop everything and fly across the world, Torsten. The gallery has an excellent staff," he finished for her. "You've said so yourself, and you haven't taken a vacation in 3 years, according to what you told me last night." "That's true, but—" Sandra hesitated. "Wouldn't I be in the way? You'll be in meetings all day." "Not all day," Torsten corrected, "and the evenings would be ours. There's a contemporary art museum I'd love to show you, and a night market that would inspire you." Sandra bit her lip, clearly tempted. "My passport is expired. That can be expedited. I don't have clothes for whatever fancy business events you might need to attend." "Singapore has excellent shopping," Torsten countered with a smile. "Or you could wear nothing at all to the events, though that might distract me from negotiating effectively." Sandra laughed, swatting his arm playfully. "Be serious." "I am," Torsten said, his smile fading into earnestness. "I want you with me, Sandra. I want to share my world with you, not keep you separate from it. And I want to have you to come home to after those interminable meetings filled with people who only see the businessman, never the man." The vulnerability in his voice touched something deep in Sandra's heart. "What would we tell people about us?" "The truth," Torsten said simply, "that we're together, that it's new but important." "Together," Sandra repeated, testing the word. "Are we?" In answer, Torsten kissed her with a tenderness that conveyed more than words could express. "If you want to be," he murmured against her lips. "I do," Sandra whispered back, "but Singapore might be rushing things. Why don't we start with dinner tomorrow night? And maybe the night after that you could attend the gallery's youth art showcase. It's not Singapore, but it matters." "To me," Torsten saw the wisdom in her counter-proposal. "Agreed, one step at a time." As rain began to fall outside, drumming gently against her windows, they held each other in the darkened room, both aware that they were venturing into uncharted territory, a place where wagers and transactions had no meaning, where only truth and trust could guide them forward. The bet might have brought them together, but it would take far more than a night of restraint or $5 million to keep them that way. It would take courage and patience and the willingness to remain vulnerable, even when every instinct urged retreat. In the safety of each other's arms, they silently made a new wager, not with words or terms or conditions, but with the language of touch and trust and tentative hope. A bet not on what they could resist, but on what they might build together. Chapter 8. Barriers. Their relationship bloomed in the privacy of his penthouse and her apartment. For the first 2 weeks, they existed in a world of their own creation, learning each other's bodies, sharing stories from their pasts, discovering the small intimacies that bind two people together. How Torsten couldn't begin his morning without classical music playing softly in the background. How Sandra unconsciously hummed while reading, the way they both preferred the left side of the bed. But relationships, like plants, cannot thrive in closed environments forever. Eventually, they must weather the elements of the outside world. The first test came on a Tuesday evening at Sandra's gallery. The children's art program was hosting a special exhibition, pieces created by young artists from Haarlem's most challenged neighborhoods. Sandra had mentioned it to Torsten, careful to keep her tone casual despite how much his attendance meant to her. "I'll be there," he'd promised, kissing her before leaving for a morning of meetings. By 6 o'clock, the gallery was filled with excited children in their best clothes, proud parents taking countless photos, community members offering support. Sandra moved through the crowd, her heart swelling with pride at what these young artists had accomplished with limited resources but unlimited imagination. At 6:30, she checked her phone for the third time. No messages from Torsten. "He'll be here," Zora assured her, catching the glance. "Probably stuck in traffic." "Of course," Sandra agreed, pasting on a smile as she welcomed another family. When 7 o'clock came and went with no sign of Torsten, disappointment settled in her chest. At 7:30, just as 14-year-old Marcus was about to present his artist's statement to the assembled guests, the gallery door opened and Torsten strode in. Relief flooded through Sandra, quickly tempered by the realization that his entrance had interrupted Marcus, whose nervous confidence faltered as heads turned toward the impeccably dressed newcomer. "Please continue," Torsten said to Marcus, his voice gentle despite its authoritative timbre. "I apologize for the interruption." Marcus gathered himself and resumed his presentation, but the moment of disruption hung in the air. As Sandra caught Torsten's eye across the room, she saw genuine regret in his expression, yet couldn't help noticing how dramatically his tailored suit and commanding presence stood out in the modest gallery space. Later, after the children and their families had departed, Sandra and Torsten found a moment alone in her small office. "I'm sorry I was late," he said immediately. "The Tokyo acquisition had a last-minute complication that required my personal attention." "I understand," Sandra replied, and she did, intellectually. "But Torsten, you missed most of the exhibition. These kids worked for months on their pieces." "I know," he said, running a hand through his normally perfect hair, a gesture of genuine distress she was coming to recognize. "I tried to get away. Sooner. I had the car waiting for over an hour while we finalized the terms." Sandra sighed, fighting the urge to simply accept his apology and move on. "This was important to me," she said finally, "not just professionally, but personally. These aren't just random children. They're kids I've watched grow and develop as artists for years." Torsten took her hands in his. "I know, and I wanted to be here for the entire event, for you and for them." His thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms. "I'm still learning how to balance everything, how to be the man you deserve while still handling my responsibilities." The sincerity in his voice melted her disappointment. "I don't expect you to abandon your work for me," she said, "but maybe we need to be more realistic about what we can promise each other." Torsten nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Agreed, better to under-promise and over-deliver than the reverse." This first small fracture healed quickly, papering over the underlying issue, the vastly different nature of their daily lives and responsibilities. But more tests followed, each revealing new points of tension in their developing relationship. The second came at a charity gala for the Metropolitan Opera, where Torsten served on the board. Sandra accompanied him, wearing a midnight blue gown he'd had delivered to her apartment, a gesture she found both touching and slightly unsettling. The dress fit perfectly, as if he'd memorized every curve of her body, which perhaps he had. "You look breathtaking," he'd whispered when he first saw her, his eyes dark with an appreciation that made her heart race despite her misgivings about the gift. At the gala, Torsten introduced her to everyone with evident pride. Sandra felt his hand at the small of her back, supportive and possessive all at once as they navigated the glittering crowd. She noticed the speculative glances, the raised eyebrows, the whispered comments when people thought she wasn't looking. She must be his latest project, she overheard one elegantly dressed woman murmur to another while they stood at the bar. "You know how these self-made men are? They like to collect exotic experiences." The words stung more than Sandra wanted to admit, especially when she caught sight of Torsten deep in conversation with the event chairwoman, a stunning blonde who stood too close, her hand casually touching his arm as she laughed at something he'd said. "Sandra," Torsten called, his face brightening when he spotted her. "Come meet Caroline. We were just discussing potential funding for your gallery's children's program." The blonde turned, her smile professionally warm. "Sandra, Torsten was just telling me about your work. I'm on the board of the Children's Arts Foundation. We should talk about possible collaboration." "I'd like that," Sandra replied, genuine, despite her lingering discomfort. Later, as they rode home in Torsten's private car, he sensed her quietness. "What's wrong?" he asked, taking her hand. "Nothing," Sandra said automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, no, not nothing. Tonight was difficult." Torsten frowned. "In what way? Did someone say something to you?" "Not to me," Sandra admitted. "But I heard things. About us, about being your latest project or exotic experience." Anger flashed across Torsten's face. "Who said that? Tell me, and You'll what?" Sandra interrupted. "Confront them, cut them from your social circle? That would only confirm what they already believe, that I don't belong in your world." "That's ridiculous," Torsten said firmly. "You belong wherever you choose to be." "It's not that simple," Sandra sighed. "When people look at us, they don't see two people who care about each other. They see a rich white man and a black woman from Harlem, and they make assumptions." "Let them assume," Torsten said, bringing her hand to his lips. "What matters is what's true between us." His certainty comforted her, yet a seed of doubt had been planted that wouldn't easily be dislodged. The third test came when the first phase of gallery expansion was completed, thanks to Torsten's $5 million donation. A reception was planned to thank donors and showcase the new facilities, including dedicated spaces for children's workshops and emerging artist exhibitions. Torsten arrived early, helping Sandra arrange chairs and hang last-minute signage. Simple tasks that nonetheless earned him surprised glances from the gallery volunteers, unused to seeing a billionaire businessman handling such mundane chores. As guests began to arrive, primarily local artists, community leaders, and long-time gallery supporters, Torsten remained close to Sandra, yet she noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor. The ease he displayed in his own social circles was replaced by a careful attentiveness, as if he was hyper-aware of being an outsider here. "So you're Torsten," said Marcus, the teenage artist whose presentation had been interrupted weeks earlier. Now he stood taller, his eyes assessing the man beside Sandra with undisguised scrutiny. "Your money built this?" He gestured to the expanded space. "Sandra's vision built this," Torsten corrected gently. "I just provided resources." Marcus nodded, seemingly satisfied with the response. "Your art collection is worth more than this whole neighborhood, right?" "Marcus," Sandra admonished, embarrassed by the direct question. "It's all right," Torsten said, meeting the young man's gaze directly. "My collection is valuable, yes, but art isn't about monetary worth. It's about what it makes you feel, what it helps you understand about yourself and the world. That's what Miss Christina always says, Marcus replied, surprise evident in his tone. She's a wise woman, Torsten said with a small smile. I'm still learning from her myself. This exchange eased some of Sandra's concern about Torsten's comfort in her world, but she couldn't miss the whispered conversations that stopped when they approached, the speculative glances from people who had known her for years. That's her rich boyfriend, she overheard one of her longtime artists say to a newcomer. 5 mil buys a lot of influence, you know? The implication that she'd somehow sold out by accepting Torsten's donation, money won fairly through their wager and spent entirely on the gallery, cut deep. She'd dedicated years to creating opportunities for this very community. How dare they judge her relationship without knowing the first thing about what existed between her and Torsten? Yet even as she bristled at their assumptions, part of her understood. From the outside, it would be easy to see her relationship with Torsten as transactional, his wealth for her. What? Her body? Her artistic credibility? The community connections he lacked? These uncomfortable thoughts lingered even as she found Torsten studying an intricate mural created by the Teen Art Collective, his expression thoughtful and engaged. These young artists have remarkable talent, he said when he noticed her approach. Their use of color reminds me of Basquiat in his early years, raw, intuitive, powerful. The genuine appreciation in his voice soothed her turbulent thoughts. Whatever others might think, she knew the truth, that Torsten saw beauty where others saw only poverty, that he valued these children's creative expression as much as the masterpieces in his collection. As the weeks passed, the challenges of bridging their different worlds continued to emerge in unexpected ways. Their schedules often conflicted, Sandra's days filled with hands-on work with young artists, community meetings, and the creative chaos of a growing gallery. Torsten's dominated by international calls, strategy sessions, and the precise choreography of major business deals. They learned to compromise, Torsten adjusting board meetings to attend important gallery events, Sandra rearranging workshops to accompany him to business dinners where her perspective often surprised and impressed his colleagues. Yet each adjustment required negotiation, each compromise a reminder of the fundamental differences in their daily lives. The strain began to show in small ways. When Torsten had to cancel their plans for the 3rd time in 2 weeks due to a business emergency, Sandra's understanding tone couldn't quite mask her disappointment. I know your work is important, she said during their late-night phone call, but I haven't seen you in 10 days, Torsten. I miss you too, he said, exhaustion evident in his voice. This acquisition is just at a critical stage. Once it's complete, there will be another one, Sandra finished for him. There's always another deal, another crisis, another reason you can't step away. Silence stretched between them, tense and uncomfortable. That's not fair, Torsten finally said. My work isn't a hobby, Sandra. People's livelihoods depend on the decisions I make. And what about us? Sandra asked quietly. What do we depend on when we barely have time to be in the same room? The question hung unanswered, as Torsten was called away to another urgent call. When he texted later to continue their conversation, Sandra replied that she needed sleep before an early workshop with the children. The gap between their words grew, filled with unspoken fears and resentments. Their individual insecurities, temporarily overshadowed by the intensity of their initial connection, began to resurface. Sandra found herself increasingly sensitive to reminders of Torsten's wealth, the casual way he ordered a rare bottle of wine without checking the price, his incomprehension when she mentioned waiting for a sale to purchase art supplies for the gallery, the fact that he'd never used public transportation in New York. For his part, Torsten struggled with Sandra's independence, her refusal to let him solve problems with money, Her insistence on maintaining her small apartment in Harlem, even though she spent most nights at his penthouse, her occasional need for solitude that left him feeling unexpectedly bereft. Everything came to a head at the opening of a major exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum. Sandra had been invited in her professional capacity as a curator, and Torsten accompanied her as her date, a reversal of their usual dynamic that they both initially enjoyed. The evening began well, with Sandra confidently introducing Torsten to her professional colleagues, many of whom were eager to meet the man who had so generously funded the Harlem Gallery's expansion. But as the night progressed, Sandra noticed Torsten becoming increasingly withdrawn, his responses shorter, his customary warmth dimming. "What's wrong?" she finally asked when they had a moment alone. "Nothing," he said automatically, then sighed. "That man you were speaking with earlier, the one with the grey beard, he suggested that my donation to your gallery was essentially a fee for services rendered." Sandra stilled. What services did he imagine? "He didn't say explicitly," Torsten replied, his jaw tight, but his implication was clear enough. Hot anger flashed through Sandra. "Who was it? I'll set him straight immediately." "It doesn't matter," Torsten said, though his eyes still held hurt. "It's not the first time I've heard whispers like that. Just as you've heard comments about being my project or exotic experience." "And that bothers you," Sandra stated, something cold settling in her stomach. "What people think?" "No," Torsten said firmly. "What bothers me is seeing you hurt by their assumptions. What bothers me is feeling like we're constantly fighting an uphill battle just to be together." "So what are you saying?" Sandra asked, fear making her voice brittle. "That it's too difficult, that we should give up?" "I didn't say that," Torsten replied, frustration evident in his tone. "I'm saying it's hard, and I don't know how to fix it." "Maybe you can't fix everything with money or power, Torsten," Sandra snapped, immediately regretting the words, but unable to take them back. His face closed like a shutter falling. "Is that what you think of me? That I believe everything? As a price? No." Sandra backtracked, reaching for his hand. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. But the damage was done. A wall had risen between them, built of misunderstandings, insecurities, and the 1,000 small compromises they'd both made, trying to bridge their different worlds." They left the exhibition early, the car ride back to Sandra's apartment thick with tension. As they pulled up outside her building, Torsten finally broke the silence. "Perhaps we need some time," he said quietly, "to think about what we really want from this relationship." The words hit Sandra like a physical blow. "Are you breaking up with me?" "No," Torsten said quickly, turning to face her fully. "I'm suggesting we take a step back and consider if we can overcome these barriers, or if we're just hurting each other by trying to force something that might not work." Tears pricked at Sandra's eyes. "So you don't think it will work?" "I didn't say that," Torsten replied, frustration evident in his voice. "I'm trying to be realistic about the challenges we face." "Realistic," Sandra repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. "Another word for giving up when things get difficult." Anger flashed in Torsten's eyes. "That's unfair. I've never given up on anything I truly wanted." "And do you truly want this, Torsten?" Sandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you truly want me?" Instead of answering immediately, Torsten reached for her, pulling her into a kiss that was both desperate and tender, as if he could communicate through touch what words were failing to convey. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I want you more than I've ever wanted anything," he whispered. "That's what terrifies me." "Then fight for us," Sandra pleaded, her hands gripping his shoulders. "Don't let fear or other people's opinions drive us apart." For a moment she thought she'd reached him. Then his phone rang, that distinctive tone he used only for the most urgent business matters. Sandra watched as conflict played across his features. "Take it," she said, pulling away. It's important. Sandra, it's fine, she interrupted, reaching for the door handle. This conversation clearly isn't going to be resolved tonight anyway. Before he could respond, she was out of the car, hurrying toward her building without looking back. By the time she reached her apartment, tears were streaming down her face. Inside, she sank onto her couch, replaying their argument in her mind. Had she been unfair? Had he? Were the barriers between them truly insurmountable, or were they creating obstacles where none needed to exist? Her phone buzzed with a text from Torsten. I'm sorry for how that ended. The call was Tokyo again. Can we talk tomorrow when we're both calmer? Sandra stared at the message, unable to formulate a response that wouldn't make things worse. Finally, she simply replied, Maybe we do need time, space to think clearly. His response came quickly. If that's what you want, I'll respect it. But know this. What exists between us is rare, Sandra. I've never felt this way before. I don't want to lose it. The sincerity of his words made fresh tears spring to her eyes. She typed back, I don't either, but maybe wanting isn't enough. Then she turned off her phone, unable to bear any further communication that night. As rain began to fall outside her window, Sandra wrapped herself in a blanket, feeling more alone than she had in years. Across town, in his penthouse high above the city, Torsten stood at the windows watching the same rain, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand, wondering how something that had begun with such promise could have fractured so quickly. The night they had spent together during their wager had been magical, transformative. But perhaps real magic wasn't found in a single perfect night, but in the daily work of building something that could last. A task that required more courage than either of them had yet managed to summon. Chapter 9. Transformation. 3 weeks of silence stretched between them like an ocean, vast, deep, and seemingly impossible to cross. Sandra threw herself into her work at the gallery, extending hours for children's programs and beginning plans for a community mural project. Exhausting herself physically left less energy for the heart-aching thoughts of Torsten that ambushed her in quiet moments. The expanded gallery space that had once felt like such a triumph now haunted her with memories. His absence was a presence of its own, following her through days that grew longer and nights that offered little rest. "Have you called him?" Zora asked one evening as they sat in Sandra's office after closing. "No," Sandra said, sorting grant applications with forced concentration. "We agreed to take space." "Space doesn't mean forever," Zora pointed out gently. "It's been almost a month, Sandra. What are you waiting for?" "I don't know," Sandra admitted, her voice small. "For clarity about whether we can actually make this work, for some sign that he hasn't already moved on. Has he given you any reason to think he's moved on?" "No," Sandra sighed, "but he hasn't reached out either." "Maybe he's respecting your request for space," Zora suggested. "Maybe he's hurting too." The next day, while reviewing the gallery's budget with her financial manager, Sandra discovered something unexpected. "There's been another deposit from Laab's Holdings," the manager said, showing her the statement. $1 million, designated specifically for the community mural project you've been planning. Sandra stared at the statement in disbelief. When did this come in? 3 days ago, without a word, without even a note, just quiet support for work he knew mattered to her. The gesture was so typically Torsten, understated, generous, and deeply thoughtful. Before she could process what this might mean, the gallery's architect arrived for their scheduled meeting about the rooftop renovation. "I've incorporated those design changes you requested," he said, spreading blueprints across her desk. "The garden areas here and here, the adjustable canopy system for weather protection, and the terrace with city views." Sandra studied the plans, frowning slightly. "These aren't the changes I requested," she said, pointing to several elements. The hydroponic garden wall, the observation platform with telescopes. I never asked for these. The architect looked confused. These came from Mr. Leibs's office. I was told they were your joint vision for the space. Joint vision, Sandra repeated, stunned. When did you speak with Torsten? His office has been coordinating with us for weeks, the architect explained. Ever since the project began, I assumed you knew. All this time, while they'd been apart, Torsten had been quietly working behind the scenes, supporting her vision, enhancing it with his own thoughtful contributions. That night, Sandra's phone rang with an unknown international number. Hello, Ms. Christina. This is Greta Müller calling from Bremen, Germany. I'm trying to reach Torsten Labs on an urgent matter, and his office gave me your number as an emergency contact. Sandra's pulse quickened with alarm. Emergency contact? Is something wrong? Perhaps, the woman said, her voice softening. Torsten came to Bremen 2 days ago. He visited his grandmother's grave, then disappeared. He missed important meetings. This is not like him. No, Sandra agreed, worry mounting. It's not. Do you have any idea where he might be? His hotel room is untouched since yesterday morning, but the concierge mentioned he asked about transportation to the coastal village of Bremen. It's where his grandmother's cottage still stands. Without allowing herself to overthink, Sandra booked the next available flight to Germany. The coastal village of Bremen was exactly as Torsten had described it during their night together. A picturesque cluster of houses facing the North Sea. The cottage sat apart from the village, nestled against a backdrop of waving sea grasses on a low bluff overlooking the water. Before she could knock, the door opened, and there stood Torsten, unshaven, dressed in simple work clothes, his expression shifting from surprise to disbelief, to something so vulnerably hopeful it made her breath catch. "Sandra," he whispered, as if he couldn't trust his eyes. "Your office is looking for you," she said, suddenly shy. "You missed meetings. People are worried." "How did you find me?" Greta Müller called. "She said I was listed as your emergency. Contact." Something flickered across Torsten's face. Embarrassment, perhaps, or vulnerability. "I never removed you," he admitted. "I couldn't bring myself to." "May I come in?" Sandra finally asked. The cottage's interior was exactly as he had described, small but filled with color and light. Hand-woven tapestries hung on the walls, their vibrant patterns transforming the simple space into something magical. Sandra noticed an easel set up, near the window overlooking the sea, a half-finished painting resting on it. "Your painting," she observed, moving closer to examine the canvas. The image showed the coastline at dawn, the sea and sky merging in shades of gold and blue. "I needed to process some things," Torsten said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Painting was my first language before I learned to hide behind words." Sandra turned to face him fully. "Why did you come here, Torsten? Why now?" He met her gaze, all pretense stripped away. "Because I've been fighting the wrong battle," he said simply. "I've been trying to make our relationship work within my carefully constructed life, rather than building a new life that could actually hold what we have together." "And what do we have together?" "Everything," Torsten said, his voice rough with emotion. "Everything that matters, Sandra. When I'm with you, I remember who I was before the world taught me to be someone else. When I'm with you, I feel whole." "I've missed you," Sandra whispered. "So much." "I've missed you too," he replied, still keeping a careful distance, as if uncertain of his welcome. "Every day, every hour." "Then why didn't you call?" Sandra asked, the question that had haunted her for weeks finally voiced. "You asked for space," Torsten said simply. "I was trying to respect that while I figured out how to be the man you deserve." "And have you?" Sandra asked softly. "Figured it out?" A smile touched Torsten's lips, genuine but tinged with sadness. I'm working on it. Coming here, to where my grandmother raised me, was part of that. Remembering who I was before I built all those walls. I fell in love with who you are now, Sandra said, taking a step closer to him. Not some idealized version of who you used to be or might become. Torsten's eyes widened. You've never said that before, that you love me. Neither have you, Sandra pointed out, her heart hammering in her chest. I do, Torsten said immediately, closing the remaining distance between them. I love you, Sandra Christina. I have since that first night, perhaps even before. I was just too afraid to name it. Afraid of what? Sandra asked, needing to understand. Of losing you, he admitted. Of not being enough. Of failing at the one thing that matters most to me. Sandra reached up, gently cupping his face with her hand. Love isn't about being enough, Torsten. It's about being real, honest, present. Torsten led her to a table by the window where several sketchbooks lay open. I've been working on something, he said, a note of nervousness in his voice, a vision for what could be. The sketches showed a building, modern yet warm, with elements of the gallery she'd created in Harlem, integrated with new spaces for artist residences, community gathering areas, gardens, and classrooms. The Sandra Christina Center for Community Arts, Torsten explained, showing her the concept drawings, not just in Harlem, but with satellite locations in underserved neighborhoods across the city, places where children can discover art the way you did. Sandra stared at the drawings, overwhelmed by the scope of his vision and the thoughtfulness behind it. This would take millions, she said softly. Yes, Torsten agreed without hesitation. And I can think of no better use for my resources. But this isn't just about money, Sandra realized, studying the carefully considered details in the drawings. You've thought about the programming, the community integration, the partnerships with schools. Because I've been listening to you, Torsten said simply. This isn't my project, Sandra. It's yours. I'm just offering the means to make it happen on a scale you couldn't achieve alone. There's more, Torsten said quietly, turning to the next page in the sketchbook. The drawing showed his grandmother's cottage, but expanded, with a modern studio attached to the original structure, large windows facing the sea. A place for us, he explained, somewhere we could come to create, to rest, to remember what matters most, not to live full-time. Your work is in New York, and much of mine still is too, but a sanctuary when we need it. You did all this without knowing if I'd ever speak to you again, Sandra said, tears filling her eyes. I had to try, Torsten said simply. Even if you decided we couldn't be together, these projects are worth doing. Your vision deserves to be realized, whether or not you want me in your life. Sandra moved into his arms then, the separation of weeks dissolving as if it had never been. Their kiss held all the longing, all the understanding, all the hope that had grown even in their time apart. I do want you in my life, she whispered against his lips. Not because of what you can give me or what you can build, but because of who you are, who we are together. As night fell over the North Sea, they sat before the fire in his grandmother's cottage. Plans spread around them, dreams taking shape in the space between them. The transformation that had begun during that first night of their wager had come full circle, bringing them back to each other stronger, clearer, more certain of what they had found and what they wanted to build together. I was so afraid of losing myself in you, Sandra admitted, nestled against Torsten's side, of becoming just an extension of your world, your wealth. And I was afraid of being wanted only for what I could provide, Torsten replied, his fingers gently stroking her arm. Not for who I am beneath all that. We were both operating from fear, Sandra realized, making decisions based on what we might lose rather than what we could create together. Not anymore, Torsten promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. From now on, we build from love, not fear. Outside, the North Sea crashed against the shore, constant and changing all at once, like the love that had brought them back to each other, stronger for having weathered the storm. 6 months later, the Harlem Community Arts Center buzzed with anticipation. What had once been Sandra's modest gallery had transformed into a vibrant hub that sprawled across 3 connected buildings, its colorful facade featuring a mural created by local youth artists. Tonight was the grand opening celebration, bringing together 2 worlds that had once seemed impossibly far apart. Sandra stood in her office, smoothing down the fabric of her gown, a stunning creation in deep crimson that echoed the dress she'd worn the night she first met Torsten. Though this one had been designed specifically for her by a young fashion student from the neighborhood, the symbolism wasn't lost on her. Same color, different dress, different woman wearing it. "You look beautiful," Zora said, entering without knocking as usual. "Nervous? Terrified," Sandra admitted with a laugh. "There are board members from every major arts organization in the city out there, alongside kids from the neighborhood, and their families. What if they don't mix? What if this whole vision falls apart tonight?" "They'll mix because you and Torsten will make sure they do," Zora said confidently. "Speaking of which, where is your handsome German?" "Supervising the final setup for the surprise," Sandra replied, her eyes sparkling with excitement despite her nerves. "He's been working on it for weeks, won't even tell me exactly what it is." The center's grand opening had been planned to showcase the fusion of their visions, Sandra's deep community connections and understanding of grassroots arts education paired with Torsten's resources and business acumen. The result was more magnificent than either could have created alone. A knock at the door interrupted them. Julian stood there, looking surprisingly at ease in a setting far removed from the elite financial circles he usually inhabited. "It's time," he said, smiling at Sandra. "Torsten sent me to fetch you, and if I may say so, you look radiant." Sandra took a deep breath, accepting Julian's offered arm. "Let's do this." The main gallery space had been transformed for the evening. Artwork from professional artists shared the walls with pieces created by the center's young students, each displayed with equal care and appreciation. Community members mingled with philanthropists, art critics chatted with local teachers, and children darted between elegant cocktail dresses and tailored suits, their excitement infectious. As Sandra entered, a hush fell over the crowd. She scanned the room for Torsten, but couldn't spot him among the faces turned toward her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian announced beside her, "Ms. Sandra Christina, Executive Director and founder of the Harlem Community Arts Center." Applause erupted as Sandra moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, introducing people from different worlds to each other, ensuring no one felt out of place. She'd become adept at bridging these gaps over the past months, just as Torsten had learned to move comfortably among her community, earning trust through consistent presence and genuine engagement rather than just financial support. "Have you seen Torsten?" she asked Julian after completing a circuit of the room. Julian checked his watch with a mysterious smile. "He should be ready now. This way." He led her toward a section of the center that had been closed off behind velvet ropes, a sign indicating "Special Exhibition, opening tonight." The crowd seemed to follow naturally, as if this movement had been orchestrated in advance. Julian positioned Sandra at the front of the gathered guests, then stepped aside. The lights dimmed slightly and a spotlight illuminated the closed exhibition doors. "Ladies and gentlemen," a familiar accented voice called out, sending a thrill through Sandra, even after all these months. "Welcome to the grand opening of the Harlem Community Arts Center." Torsten emerged from the shadows, devastatingly handsome, in a charcoal suit that highlighted his broad shoulders and intense blue eyes. He moved to stand beside Sandra, taking her hand naturally, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become as necessary as breathing. 6 months ago, this center was just a vision, Torsten continued, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. A dream shared by myself and the extraordinary woman beside me. But vision without action remains just a dream. Tonight, we celebrate not just a building or programs, but a philosophy that art belongs to everyone, that creativity knows no boundaries of class or color or circumstance, that beauty can transform lives when we make it accessible. Sandra squeezed his hand, overwhelmed by his words and the journey that had brought them here. From a reckless bet at a charity gala to this moment of shared triumph, it seemed both impossible and inevitable. Behind these doors, Torsten continued, is a special exhibition that represents the heart of what we're building here. I invite you all to experience it, but first, he turned to Sandra, his eyes softening, I would like to ask the woman who made all this possible to do the honors of opening this exhibition. He handed Sandra a small golden key. She looked at him questioningly, but his expression revealed nothing beyond tender encouragement. With curious anticipation, Sandra approached the exhibition doors and inserted the key into the lock. As the doors swung open, gasps rippled through the crowd behind her, but Sandra stood frozen on the threshold, her hand flying to her mouth in astonishment. The gallery space beyond had been transformed into a celebration of their love story. Along one wall hung Torsten's paintings, documenting their journey from that first night together through their separation and reunion. His artistic talent, hidden for so many years, was revealed in works of stunning emotional depth and technical skill. The center of the room featured a sculptural installation representing the original Bet, two figures positioned across from each other, the space between them charged with possibility. As viewers walked around the piece, the perspective shifted, eventually revealing that the figures were actually reaching toward each other, their fingers nearly touching in a moment of connection that evoked Michelangelo's creation of Adam. But what brought tears to Sandra's eyes was the far wall, where dozens of portraits hung, children from the center's programs, community members, artists they had supported, all rendered with Torsten's remarkable ability to capture not just likeness, but essence. At the center of this community tapestry hung a portrait of Sandra herself, surrounded by the children she had dedicated her life to serving, her face illuminated with the passion that had first drawn Torsten to her. Torsten, she whispered, turning to find him watching her reaction with vulnerable hope. Do you like it? He asked softly, suddenly uncertain despite months of planning. Instead of answering with words, Sandra drew him into a kiss that spoke volumes, forgetting momentarily about the crowd, watching them with knowing smiles and misty eyes. When they finally separated, Torsten kept his arms around her waist, their foreheads touching intimately. I have something else for you, he murmured. Something private, for later. The promise in his voice sent a shiver of anticipation through Sandra, but before she could respond, they were surrounded by well-wishers, eager to congratulate them. On both the center and the exhibition, the evening flowed like a dream after that. Speeches from community leaders, performances by young musicians from the center's programs, tours of the new facilities that would serve thousands of children. In the coming years, throughout it all, Torsten remained by Sandra's side, their connection evident to everyone who saw them together. As the formal part of the evening concluded and guests began to mingle more freely, Julian approached them with a champagne toast. To the most expensive bet ever lost, he said with a wink, raising his glass. Torsten laughed, his arm around Sandra's waist. Best investment I ever made. So it all really started with a bet? Asked one of the board members who had overheard the exchange. The rumors are true. Sandra and Torsten exchanged a look filled with private meaning. Yes and no, Sandra replied diplomatically. The bet brought us together, but what kept us together was something neither of us wagered on. Hours later, when the last guests had departed and the centre stood quiet in the early morning hours, Torsten led Sandra back to the exhibition room. "There's one piece I didn't display publicly," he said, removing a draped canvas from behind. "A panel. This one is just for you." He unveiled the painting with gentle hands. Sandra gasped at the image. Herself, as she had been that first night, naked and vulnerable in the golden light of dawn, but rendered with such reverence and artistic skill that the effect was one of profound beauty rather than mere sensuality. More than her physical form, Torsten had captured the moment of transformation, the exact instant when their wager had evolved into something neither had anticipated. "This is how I saw you," Torsten said softly. "Not just your beauty, which is considerable, but your courage. Your willingness to be seen, truly seen, at a moment when I had forgotten how to look beneath surfaces." Sandra touched the canvas gently, moved beyond words by this gift. "You kept your part of our bet after all," she said finally. "You've helped me curate your collection, make it meaningful, and you've more than earned your 5 million, Torsten replied with a smile. "Though I'd happily pay it again for another night like our first." "That can be arranged," Sandra murmured, stepping into his arms. "No bet required this time. Just us." Torsten's eyes darkened as his hands found her waist. "I have one more surprise for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. From a small velvet box, he removed a ring, not the massive diamond many might have expected, but a delicate band of gold, supporting an emerald surrounded by tiny pearls. "This was my grandmother's," Torsten explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She told me to give it only to a woman who could see the real me beneath everything else, who would love the boy who drew pictures by the sea, not the man who built fortresses around his heart." Sandra's eyes filled with tears as he continued. "When I lost our bet that night, I thought I was sacrificing $5 million, Torsten said, holding the ring between them. "I didn't realize I was gaining something priceless instead, a chance to be truly known, truly seen, truly loved. Will you marry me, Sandra Christina? Not for what I can give you or what you can give me, but for what we create together." "Yes," Sandra whispered, her heart so full it felt as though it might burst. 1,000 times yes. As Torsten slipped the ring onto her finger, the first light of dawn began to filter through the exhibition windows, the same golden light that had painted their skin the morning they'd first surrendered to the connection between them. Full circle, Sandra thought. From one sunrise to another, from a wager based on restraint to a promise built on surrender. Later, wrapped in each other's arms in the apartment they now shared above the center, Sandra traced the lines of Torsten's face with gentle fingers. "Did you ever imagine, that night at the gala when I proposed our ridiculous bet, that we'd end up here?" Torsten caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Never," he admitted. "I thought I was accepting a challenge to prove my control. I had no idea I was actually taking the first step toward letting it go. We were both so blind," Sandra mused. "Me seeing only your wealth and privilege, you seeing only a chance to prove something to yourself." "And now?" Torsten asked, drawing her closer. "Now I see you," Sandra said simply, "and you see me, the real us beneath everything else." Outside, New York awakened to a new day, unaware that within its countless stories of love and loss, one particular tale had come full circle. A wager. Of hearts that had begun with a challenge and ended with a promise. A bet where both participants had ultimately won by losing what they thought mattered most and finding what truly did. "I love you," Torsten whispered against her hair, the words still new enough to hold wonder. "I love you too," Sandra replied, rising to kiss him as sunrise gilded their skin once more, a reminder of the dawn that had changed everything, and the countless dawns yet to come in the life they would build together.